China just did something the world never expected. A country once known for copying Western products is now threatening the very companies that invented the modern auto industry. Across Europe, Chinese electric vehicles are suddenly everywhere. Massive cargo ships owned by BYD are transporting thousands of cars across oceans at a time. And by 2026, China officially became the largest car exporter on Earth. To many people, this looks like the moment China finally defeated the West in the electric vehicle race. The cars are cheaper, the factories are faster, the technology is improving at terrifying speed. And at the center of this explosion stands BYD, a company growing so aggressively that even some European factories are now becoming takeover targets. On the surface, it looks unstoppable, but the deeper you look into China's EV industry, the stranger the story becomes. Because while Chinese EVs are flooding the world, dozens of EV companies inside China are quietly collapsing. Factories are producing more cars than people can actually buy. And behind the futuristic marketing and record-breaking export numbers, a dangerous question is starting to emerge. What if China's EV boom isn't a miracle, but a bubble desperately trying not to burst? For years, the world looked at China's EV industry as if it were the future arriving ahead of schedule. New factories appeared almost overnight. Investors flooded the sector with money. Local governments competed to attract EV companies into their cities, offering land, subsidies, tax breaks, and political support. Every few months, a new Chinese electric vehicle brand would emerge, claiming it was about to revolutionize transportation. And for a while, it genuinely looked unstoppable. China wasn't just building electric cars faster than everyone else. It was building an entire industrial ecosystem around them. Battery factories, charging infrastructure, rare earth processing, software systems, autonomous driving technology, all of it expanding at an almost absurd speed. To the outside world, it looked like China had cracked the code of the future, while the West was still debating what the future even looked like. But underneath the headlines, a dangerous problem was quietly growing. The entire Chinese EV industry had been built on one assumption: that demand would continue rising forever. And for years, it did. Chinese consumers rushed into the EV market at historic speed. Some years saw sales growth explode above 70%, creating the illusion that the market had no ceiling. Companies responded the only way they knew how, by building even more factories, producing even more vehicles, and launching even more brands. China wasn't just creating a competitive market. It was creating an overcrowded battlefield. Then the growth started slowing down. By 2026, China's domestic EV sales were still growing, but nowhere near the explosive pace that had fueled the industry's expansion. Growth dropped below 20%, a dramatic slowdown compared to previous years. For normal industries, that number would still sound healthy, but for an industry that expanded like a gold rush, it was the equivalent of hearing the music stop in the middle of a crowded casino. Because the factories never slowed down, the production lines kept moving, the companies kept manufacturing. Millions of vehicles continued pouring out of assembly plants across China. Even as the market became increasingly saturated, there were now simply too many EV companies chasing the same consumers. And then Beijing made the situation worse. For years, China's EV boom had been heavily supported by government incentives. Buyers enjoyed tax exemptions and subsidies that made electric vehicles far cheaper and more attractive. But starting in 2026, some of those benefits began fading away. Purchase taxes started returning, subsidies weakened, and suddenly the industry had to face a reality it had spent years avoiding: surviving without endless state support. That's when China's EV market turned brutal. What followed was not a normal price competition. It was economic warfare. Automakers across China began slashing prices aggressively in order to survive. Discounts appeared everywhere. Vehicles were suddenly selling for thousands of dollars cheaper almost overnight. Companies were no longer competing to maximize profits. They were competing to avoid death. And in this kind of war, size matters. BYD had one enormous advantage over many of its rivals. Unlike smaller startups burning through investor money, BYD controlled huge parts of its own supply chain, especially batteries and manufacturing. That gave the company the ability to survive on razor-thin margins longer than most competitors could. So BYD kept cutting prices. And every time it did, smaller companies suffered even more. The result was a form of industrial cannibalism. China had created so many EV companies, so much factory capacity, and so much production pressure that the industry began consuming itself from the inside. Smaller manufacturers started running out of cash. Some delayed wages, others quietly shut down production lines. Industry analysts warned that dozens of Chinese EV brands could disappear entirely within the next few years because they simply could not survive the price war anymore. And suddenly, China's EV miracle started looking very different. The world saw massive exports and futuristic cars. But inside China, the industry was becoming increasingly desperate. Because those exports may not simply be a sign of dominance, they may also be a sign that China's domestic market can no longer absorb the machine it created. China isn't just selling electric vehicles to the world anymore. It may be trying to escape its own overproduction crisis. At this point, China's EV industry was already under pressure. The domestic market was slowing down, competition had turned vicious, and dozens of smaller companies were struggling to survive. But behind all of that, another question started making analysts uncomfortable. If demand inside China was weakening, then why were factories still producing vehicles at such insane speed? Why did production numbers continue looking so strong? And then, the industry's most disturbing secret began surfacing. Reports linked to global EV market investigations started exposing a bizarre phenomenon now referred to as zero-mileage cars. On paper, these vehicles were counted as sold. In reality, many of them had barely touched a real customer. The scheme was surprisingly simple. An automaker would produce a brand new EV. Instead of selling it naturally to an actual consumer, the vehicle would be transferred through affiliated dealers, shell companies, financing arms, or third-party entities connected to the manufacturer itself. Technically, the car could now be recorded as a completed sale. Production targets were met. Sales numbers looked healthy. Government expectations were satisfied. But the car itself had never truly entered the real market. In many cases, these vehicles reportedly appeared almost immediately in used car markets, despite having virtually zero mileage on them. Some were exported abroad. Others sat in giant storage areas waiting for buyers that might never come. And suddenly, the glowing statistics surrounding China's EV boom started looking far less trustworthy. Because this raised a dangerous possibility. What if part of China's EV miracle was being artificially inflated? What if some of those impressive sales numbers were not genuine consumer demand, but the result of a system desperately trying to keep itself alive? To understand why this happened, you have to understand how China's industrial machine operates. Local governments across China are heavily judged by economic performance. Large factories create jobs, boost GDP figures, attract investment, and help local officials demonstrate growth to Beijing. In many regions, EV production became politically important. Entire cities invested enormous amounts of money into becoming the next electric vehicle hub. But there was one problem. Factories cannot simply stop. Once billions of dollars are poured into production lines, shutting them down becomes economically and politically dangerous. Idle factories mean unemployment. Unemployment creates instability, and instability is something the Chinese system fears more than almost anything else. So the pressure to keep production moving became enormous. Even if real demand was slowing, even if inventories were rising, even if companies were losing money, the machine had to keep running. And that is where the zero-mileage car phenomenon becomes so revealing. It exposes the difference between a healthy market economy and an industrial system driven by political targets and state-backed momentum. In a normal market, companies slow production when demand weakens. But in China's EV sector, slowing down became almost unacceptable. So instead, some companies found ways to keep the numbers alive. Cars were produced because factories needed output. Cars were counted because local governments needed growth. Cars were moved around because the industry needed the illusion of momentum, not necessarily because customers genuinely wanted them. And the deeper you look into the system, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Because this no longer looks like organic consumer demand powering a technological revolution. It starts looking like an industry being pumped full of artificial support just to prevent the entire structure from slowing down. China presented its EV boom as proof of industrial supremacy. But critics increasingly argue that parts of the industry resemble a giant state-supported treadmill, one that cannot afford to stop moving, even when the market underneath it is beginning to crack. This wasn't simply about electric cars anymore. It was about whether the world's largest EV industry was being driven by real demand, or by fear of what happens when the growth finally stops. For a while, China's solution to its EV problem seemed obvious: export everything. If the domestic market was becoming overcrowded, then the rest of the world could absorb the excess. And at first, it appeared to work brilliantly. Chinese electric vehicles began flooding into foreign markets at astonishing speed. Ports across Europe started receiving massive shipments of low-cost EVs. Countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East suddenly found themselves targeted by an avalanche of Chinese automotive expansion. To consumers, the offer looked irresistible. The cars were cheaper than many Western competitors. The technology looked modern. The interiors felt futuristic. And unlike traditional automakers, still struggling to transition into electric vehicles, Chinese companies were moving aggressively and fast. But governments around the world began seeing something else. They weren't just seeing competition, they were seeing overcapacity. Because from Washington to Brussels, a growing number of policymakers started believing that China was no longer exporting cars simply because of efficiency or innovation. They believed China was exporting the consequences of producing far more vehicles than its own economy could realistically consume. In other words, the world increasingly viewed China's EV exports not as normal trade, but as industrial dumping on a global scale. And that changed everything. The United States responded first and hardest. Tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles were pushed to extreme levels, reaching as high as 100%. The message was clear. America had no intention of allowing heavily subsidized Chinese EVs to overwhelm its domestic auto industry. Europe followed with its own crackdown. The European Union launched investigations into Chinese state subsidies and eventually imposed additional tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, with some rates climbing as high as 35% depending on the manufacturer. European leaders openly warned that China's industrial strategy threatened to distort global markets and destroy local manufacturing competitiveness. And suddenly, China's path to global domination no longer looked smooth. Because the deeper problem was this: China's EV industry was built inside a very specific environment that is difficult to replicate elsewhere. Cheap labor, massive state support, dense supply chains, lower energy costs, aggressive industrial coordination. Inside China, companies like BYD could operate at enormous scale with incredible efficiency. But once they moved production overseas, many of those advantages started disappearing. That's why Chinese automakers began exploring overseas factories in places like Hungary and Turkey. On the surface, these projects looked like signs of confidence and expansion, but they also revealed something else. Chinese companies were being forced to physically move closer to foreign markets simply to escape tariffs and political resistance. And doing that is expensive. Building factories abroad costs far more than building inside China. Labor is more expensive. Energy prices are often higher. Supply chains become more fragmented. Political regulations become stricter. The same manufacturing model that looked unstoppable inside China suddenly becomes far harder to maintain internationally, which creates a dangerous trap. Inside China, EV companies are trapped in brutal price wars that are crushing profits. Outside China, they face tariffs, political suspicion, and rising operational costs. They are being squeezed from both directions at the same time. And this is where the entire narrative surrounding China's EV dominance starts to shift. Because what the world once viewed as unstoppable industrial strength may actually be the symptom of a deeper structural problem. China built enormous manufacturing capacity under the assumption that global demand would always remain open and accessible. But now, more countries are beginning to protect themselves. The gates are slowly closing. And the biggest irony of all may be this: China successfully built the largest EV manufacturing machine on Earth. But it may have built far more of it than the world is ultimately willing, or even able, to absorb.